Good morning, friends. One of the harder things to contemplate from what Jesus tells his apostles in Matthew 10 is a part where he describes the judgment that will fall on all those who reject the message that he's sending the apostles out to deliver. Because in verse 14 he says, "And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town." Now we remember that Sodom and Gomorrah were essentially wiped from the face of the earth by God's judgment when he rained fire and brimstone down upon those cities from heaven due to the incredible wickedness of the people living in those cities. And yet Jesus says that it will be even worse for those who reject the message of the kingdom than it was for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in particular, that is because the people who were supposed to be receiving the message from his apostles were Jewish people. You'll remember that Jesus told his apostles not to go into the land of the Gentiles or the Samaritans, but only to the Jews, at least here at first. Because as we learned, according to God's promise, salvation must go first to the Jews. And due to God's goodness throughout history, the Jewish people, his chosen people, from the very days of Abraham, they should have been ideally suited to receive the very message of the kingdom that the apostles were bringing, because they had been given so much to prepare them to see and recognize the Messiah when he came. You'll remember that one of the points of pride, you might say, for the Jewish people was that God had given them the law, what's called the law of Moses, because God used Moses as a mediator to give his law to the people. But this law was his special self-revelation to the people, so that they would know what his standards were, what his character was, what he called them to do, and so on. And he gave that to the Jewish people and not to any other nation or any other group of people. But it seemed that many of the Jewish people, perhaps most of the Jewish people, certainly including the Pharisees and other religious leaders as a whole, chose to ignore much of what they were told in that revelation of God and from God, especially about the Messiah, even as the Messiah came into their midst there in the advent of Jesus Christ to the earth. Because they knew from so many prophecies that the Messiah would come to redeem Israel. But then they didn't realize or didn't think about it or just set aside the idea that the whole sacrificial system was all about redemption and how one becomes redeemed. Because the sacrificial system itself, the practice of sacrificing an animal for the remission of sins, for redemption from sins, pointed to the ultimate activity of the Messiah. And so that system taught them that sin required death, that the price had to be paid for. And for there to be redemption, there had to be shedding of blood, and someone had to bear the price for that sin. And yet when Jesus came as the Messiah, when he came and it became clear he was not going to overthrow Rome, he was not going to bring national physical Israel back to the world stage, then they concluded that he couldn't be the Messiah. They wanted redemption to mean freedom from foreign oppression, even though thousands of years of God's law had taught them that redemption meant freedom from the consequences of sin. And that's what Christ came to bring. That's what he taught about in his earthly ministry. And this is just one reason why the Jewish people, who were, of course, well informed about the sacrificial law, as well as the Old Testament commands, why they should have recognized Jesus as the Messiah when he came, and why their punishment for those living then would be so severe, even worse than that of Sodom and Gomorrah, because while they had every advantage, they had all the knowledge of what the Messiah would come to do, and they should have understood it. They still rejected him despite the fact that he did exactly what was foretold of him in both the law and the prophets. And as we're reminded from Luke 12:48, to whom much was given, of him much will be required. Which then brings us to consider our own situation once again. What has God given to us for our benefit to know the Messiah? We may not be descended physically from Abraham. We may not be counted among ethnically Jewish people. But God has nevertheless, if you're living here in the United States or most Western countries, He has given us much as well, and we need to take heed of the same warning Jesus gave to the Jewish people, because they had every advantage in knowing the truth, and yet they rejected the truth, meaning they would be judged more severely. And while it comes to us in slightly different ways, we too, in the Western world, have many of those, if not all of those same advantages in knowing the truth. We have very easy access to the truth, to the self-revelation of God. If you have access to the internet, which means if you're a person even if you don't have internet within your own home, if you're able to get to a public library or a friend's house or a school, well, you have access to the internet. And if you have access to the internet, you have access to dozens of free translations of the Bible. You have access to dozens of free commentaries on the scriptures to help you understand. And while you certainly have to be careful because not every source on the internet is reliable, hopefully we all understand this, that not everything you read on the internet or every YouTube clip you watch on the internet or listen to is going to be reliable. And I say that fully understanding that people who are listening to this are doing so on YouTube, and that there are YouTubers I would beg you to stay away from because they will lead you astray. But nevertheless, with just a little bit of guidance, you can find the deep truths of the scriptures plainly laid out for you, even here on YouTube and scattered around the internet, freely accessible to basically everyone, again, at least here in the U.S. and in most Western countries. And aside from that, our towns are full of churches, many of which have pastors who will gladly and eagerly sit down with you and answer your questions. Now, again, I hate that I have to make this little disclaimer here, but picking a church at random and walking in is about as reliable as clicking on any random so-called Christian YouTube video nowadays. There are a lot of there's places that are churches, but they're only churches in name, and pastors who are only pastors by title, and they're not really interested in God's truth, just like the Pharisees back in Jesus' day claimed to be interested in the truth, but really they were just interested in themselves. But nevertheless, there are good, Bible-believing, God-honoring churches and God-honoring pastors out there, even as there is God-honoring YouTube videos on YouTube, despite all the rest of the stuff that's not so much. So we have pastors, we have theologians, we have Sunday school teachers, we have Bibles freely available, freely handed out on so many occasions. And let me tell you right now, if you don't have a Bible, if you're anywhere near the Douglas, Massachusetts, stop by Second Congregational Church. I will gladly and eagerly hand you one myself. We will sit down and talk, and I will do my very best to help you with any questions that you might have. We are awash in opportunities to grasp the knowledge of God. And so we must then ask, what are we doing with this truth? What are we doing with our opportunities to know the truth? Because we have been given by God, by His grace and goodness, so much. He's given us so many advantages in understanding His Word, to know His self-revelation and what He commands of us and what He provides for us in salvation so freely by His grace. And so we must ask, are we living according to His Word passionately and consistently and faithfully, and taking it to others around us as well? Because we must remember, it's not just about the Jewish people in terms of God's warning, because even to us, God has given us much, and so He is going to expect much from us as a result. So contemplate these truths, my friends, and I pray that we will do this together, and that it will lead us to have every day an even better and more godly day. And Lord willing, I will see you soon.